So my mum and I bought the property in 2001. She used to have a farm in England and has always wanted land ever since. This was amongst the first re-veg we did. When I came here, I knew nothing about anything, but luckily we had some friends who said, we'll give you a list of species. In fact, the guy who was leasing at the time said, oh, Sarah, you should plant some trees down there. And I went, oh, okay, which ones? He said, I'll get Steph to send you a list. Anyway, so list was duly sent, trees were planted. At the time, this was a completely cleared area. There were no trees at all around this dam. The dam used to be fresh, but has actually gone salty. It went salty in that first year. It was brackish, but too salty for stock. So that's then when we went, yep, we will definitely plant trees around it. You used to be able to see out behind the hillside over there, but you can't anymore. What is really lovely is that the trees are now self-seeding. So we don't plant in this area anymore because we can't get in to rip and mound, but we also don't need to. Because everything has self-seeded, and that's always when I know I've planted the right tree in the right place. So we've got melaleucas and she oaks. That's what's making the background noise, is the wind in the she oaks. And they're so thick in some places we can't walk through. So this was one of our first re-veg projects back in, it was sort of 2001 and 2002 jointly, and then a little bit more infilling afterwards. One of the big challenges was that this was a really wet area in the middle of winter, and that's when the first lot of trees were planted by a contractor with a ripper and mounder and tree planter all combined, and he did get bogged on several times. So after that we learned, so then we rip and mound in summer and hand plant in winter. We rip and mound in summer because it cracks the compaction layer, but it also means then we can see, we can spray out weeds. Ideally for a couple of years in a row is really good, but even if the weeds are sprayed out the year that we plant, that's better than nothing. We plant in the low-lying areas, we rip and mound, and then plant into the top of the mounds, because that gives the tree roots some some soil that's not waterlogged, particularly in this area. Another challenge we had was that there were some bare salt scalds below the dam, and we planted there with Melaleuca thioides, which is known as saltbuster, but also some of the other Melaleucas like Hamulosa and Halmatorum, and they're very salt tolerant. They're also quite waterlogging tolerant, which works really well because this does get exceptionally wet. In fact, upstream of here, the drainage line is probably a bit too narrow in its revegetation. With hindsight, I'd have put the fence line out a couple of, if not 3 or 4 meters on either side, because there have been times we've been walking up the far break, there's water running down it and fish swimming up it. So there's that much water coming down. And in fact, it comes down and then flows into this dam behind me. The dam in winter is actually at bank full level, so some of the trees over there are actually sitting in water, but then it does dry out in summer due to all the trees around it, I think. Because when we first bought the property, this was actually bare, accessible by sheep and other livestock, and was also further upstream, or further up the drainage line really, because it's not actually a stream, it doesn't run all year, but further up the hill was being cropped all the way, so there were no bird life, there were no birds coming into this area. Since we've revegetated, we've had an increase in particularly all the small birds, and in fact Andrew Huggett came as part of Moore Catchment Council, one of their projects, and he did a bird survey, and we'd done the bushland, and he said, well, it's a bit late, but we'll go down, it's 11 o'clock, probably won't see any birds, we'll go down to your revegetated drainage line. And he got very excited. He said, in birding terms, this is going off, Sarah, and then rattled off a whole load of names for me to remember, most of which I forgot, but that's fine, because he remembered. And the reason he was so excited was there was a flock of small birds of 7 different species all in the one area. And he said that proves that the re-veg was providing enough habitat and food for all those different birds that they were happy to be in the one flock in the same area altogether. And I must admit, that's pretty delightful, really, because that means it's like, oh, it's working, yay, good-o. So that, yeah, that is really good. This is a drainage line, not an actual creek line, because it doesn't flow all year round. That's because we're top of the catchment, so we are one of the starts of the Moore River, and in fact just about 4, maybe less kilometres away to our south is the Avon catchment. So we really are the very top of the catchment. There's a trig point up to the north of us, and we are so high that we really don't have anybody else's water coming onto our land. There's about one other farmer across the road, and that's it. That means that we don't have a lot of flow, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Good because we don't have the erosion in the same way. Bad in that we don't maybe have some of the diversity that we might have if we had an actual permanent water hole other than the dams, if we had, we're further down the Moore River. So this is an area we call Burnt Gully, and that's because it was actually burnt 2 years in a row because stubble fires got out of control. So it was very badly degraded. This paddock behind us, which you actually can't see now, but we're again still top of the drainage line, still top of the catchment, but the paddock behind us and probably some of the paddock around was only cleared in the late 80s. So this stuff has gone salty in a relatively short time. When we first bought the property, there was a sort of drain line which looked like it had been man-made, I'm not sure. And that was only about that deep, so we were trying to prevent it eroding anymore. Sadly, it has eroded quite a lot. It's now probably 1 metre to 1.5 metres deep, and that's despite us fencing the area off from stock and revegetating. I'm standing on bare soil because it is a salt scald, and this was going to prove really difficult to re-veg, and this is where we got Melaleuca thioides in, which is this stuff here. It's quite prickly. It does take a little while to get going. It doesn't like being waterlogged, so we was planted into mounds. The great thing about it though is it's wonderful habitat for small birds because it is very dense. It's not exactly prickly. Prickly is good for small birds because it protects them from cats and foxes. However, it's very dense and you can't walk through it. Once it's growing and the individual plants are reaching each other, that's it. You just have to walk around. But it takes a very long time before it flowers and an even longer time before it actually sets seed. So these were planted, I think, in about 2003, somewhere around there. And they didn't flower until about 2010. They have now got seed on them, but they are very slow to set seed. We also haven't seen any re-veg or natural regeneration, self-seeding from the thioides, which is a bit sad. It'll be interesting when it does happen, and I'll be very excited. The other thing we planted in here is another Melaleuca. It's got the star-shaped seed pods, which are quite beautiful. It grows really well in salt scalds that are also waterlogged, which the Melaleuca thioides doesn't like. This has obviously been fenced off since 2001, 2002. There haven't been any sheep come through here at all, and it hasn't been burnt since 2002, which is pretty good. Before we started doing any planting in here, you could actually see all the way up, and the only trees that were here were the wandoo, the white gum, on that side and that side of the creek line. There's a couple in the middle, but that was it. Everything else has been planted by us, which is pretty nice, really, because you can't see through it, and you certainly can't walk through it in places. So this area we have replanted. Some of it was done part of the old Enviro Fund. We've been really fortunate into getting funding from various landcare groups. NAC and Moore Catchment have helped us out considerably, which is always good. The area was fenced with Enviro funds. We also started getting our seedlings from Wongan trees at Wongan Hills, Dennis and Ellen Mitchell. And they have been really good to us in giving us lots of advice and saying, well, no, this might work. But they've also been really good in that I've collected seed, given it to them and then said, can you please grow it on? Which is nice because then it's really local provenance. When we started planting, the first species list I got was a bit vague. There were a few things from South Australia, like river red gums. There were some other things from further east or further south. And as the years have gone by, I have got more and more local. Unless it's some Carnaby food species, then I tend to go a little bit outside the range, just in case the Carnabys recognise it as food species. We have done some spreading of seed. I will sometimes, as we're walking through, break off branches and scatter them. That I've particularly done with these sedges that you can see behind us. They were planted out as a trial plot further down the creek line. They grew really well. There were 3 different species. 2 grew well, 1 grew particularly well. So that one is the one that I have gathered up, and I think it's Juncus Burmea. We did have Juncus acutus, spike rush from South Africa in here, but we continually removed that. We collected the seed and then dug up the plants, and as a result, when we went through here before Christmas looking for spike rush, we actually only found 2 plants, which is pretty good. We've been lucky in that there weren't a whole load in here to start with, and we got good advice from the Department of Water. In fact, they came out and identified, we were walking through talking about water and stuff, and the guy said, no, you don't want those, get rid of them. So we have done that. So this is one of my happy places. I suppose that sounds a little bit silly, but it is the place that I come down and go, wow, we have changed the landscape. It's been a really gratifying thing to do, to plant trees, plant shrubs, spread the sedges. So all these sedges have grown because I've grabbed handfuls from down at the bottom when we're walking and just chucked them into places, especially if there's a bit of a hold up like here. The samphire wasn't even here. You can see some of the white, which is the salt, as part of the salt scald. The lovely thing about thioides, I mean, I mentioned about the birds, but they're particularly good habitat for fairy wrens. I suppose a heartwarming thing is to know that we've actually provided habitat for birds that are small, not necessarily endangered, but getting less and less common in our rural landscapes. And it's been an ongoing journey. So I can now actually recognise a fairy wren call, which I could never do before. But we quite often see them. We see dragonflies like that one there, and it becomes a place of living rather than a bare salt scald, which is what it was before. It was beginning to, it still does have acid sulfate soils, but there is life here as well, and it's a beautiful place to come, and actually in all times of the year, but particularly in summer, because it's still green, it's still full of life when the paddocks are fairly empty and dry and dead looking, really, I suppose. The other thing that's particularly nice about this area is that it also links up other areas of our bushland. It acts as a conduit and a corridor for the smaller birds, the small lizards, and if we had mammals, small mammals, it would be doing that as well. Not sure we've got any, we might do, but yeah, it certainly is at least habitat for the other things, the smaller stuff in life, which is actually quite important because we need the smaller stuff as well as the bigger stuff. One of the things that I have learnt over the years, I've learnt heaps through going to landcare conferences, workshops organised by farming groups or landcare groups, talking to other people who've done it before, and then just reading lots as well, reading books and stuff. But one of the things I have learnt is just plant lots, plant a variety, plant big, small shrubs, trees even some of the annuals, if you can get hold of them, spread some seed around, because then the soil and the land itself will sort out what's meant to be growing there. We can always tell that we've got the right type of melaleuca in the drainage lines because they're the ones that self-seed and grow, and now we can't walk through them, like the Casuarina obesa. That's so thick in places, it's like a brushwood fence, and the same with some of the other melaleucas. So it is plant lots, plant a variety, and there's a bit of cross your fingers and hope it's a good season and hope you've got the right things in the right places. But over time, you can change the landscape.